Welcome to AntiTribe. We can review. So, in this week's episode, we have some ground to cover with the recent death of Latter day Saint prophet Russell Marion Nelson. And so, what you're going to see here is, up in the upper right hand corner, my right, your left, there's Russell M. Nelson, 101 years old at the time of his death. He was a prophet who did not prophesy and who, to my personal knowledge, covered up the sexual abuse allegations against his daughter, Brenda Miles, and his son in law, Dick Miles. Tonight's episode is brought to you by our unknowing sponsors, Great Value Toasted Coconut Cashews. Delicious. Get yourself some of those at your local Walmart. Since Walmart is such a fan of groundbreaking journalism and independent thought, we figured we'd give them a shout out and say that our program was brought to you by Walmart and Great Value Toasted Coconut Cashews. But back to Russell M. Nelson, the prophet who did not prophesy even once over the course of his tenure from, I believe, 2018 on. He didn't prophesy. His priesthood power, authority, and insight was such that, let's just say that Russell didn't exactly have any insight whatsoever, any prophetic insight into what was going on. So what you're seeing here is a situation where Russell M. Nelson, many of us have a bone to pick with him in terms of what happened during COVID. So let's talk about what happened during COVID. Let's talk about the emergence of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints over his tenure as a quote-unquote global church. So it's very simple. As a former Latter-day Saint, what I would say is the reason I left the church, unlike a lot of other ex-Mormons, is the fact that the church didn't follow its own rules. And what I mean by that is what you could clearly see over the course of the tenure of Russell M. Nelson was a church that was far more welcoming of sinful behavior and far more normalizing of that sinful behavior, whether it is transgenderism or lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, intersex, asex, plus what I mockingly call the LMNOP group, or the LMNOP community, if you could call it that. These are people who have constructed identities around one aspect of their behavior or one aspect of their decisions and choices. And the reason they constructed those identities is very simple. It's because they wish to be excused for the behavior that they engage in under the auspices or the coverage of those identities. So it's kind of unique in the sense that you have heterosexual people who didn't argue that the fact that they were heterosexual, if you believe in those labels and in those constructs, that sexual orientation is a thing, they didn't argue that their heterosexuality excused them from culpability for the consequences of their actions as it pertained to adultery, as it pertained to opposite sex behavior outside of wedlock or extramarital opposite sex behavior. They didn't make that argument at all. But the LMNOP community, as I call it, did exactly that. They certainly made those allegations. And so what we are seeing over the course of the last 7 years or so is the fruit of that playing out within the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. You have Charlie Bird. Many of you know him as Cosmo the Cougar. He was the BYU mascot for a number of years. He's an openly gay man who was married to his partner. He currently, in his ward, is, I understand it, thanks to John DeLynn of Mormon Stories, holds a ward calling, even though he is unrepentant, openly flouting the church's teachings on sexuality and the law of chastity, which clearly the church's doctrine is that marriage is between a biological male and a biological female. That's the family proclamation in a nutshell. This is official church dogma and doctrine. Now, why Charlie Bird and others like him haven't decamped from the church, anybody's guess, but a big part of it has to do with the fact that Russell Marion Nelson, the prophet who did not prophesy, presided over a church that was increasingly lax in its enforcement of its doctrine and dogma, at least as it pertained to sexual conduct, as it pertained to gender identity. The church recently issued guidance to wards and stakes that said that individual members or attendees at wards and stake centers who had gender dysphoria, they believe that they were born in the wrong body, if they were wearing clothing that corresponded to the gender that they delusionally believed that corresponded to their correct gender identity, those individuals could in fact use the bathroom that corresponded to their preferred gender identity, because that's exactly what it is. It's a preference. It's a delusion. It's not real. Sex is not assigned at birth. You know, it's not some subjective designation that is foisted upon you. It is biologically determined at the level of your chromosomal makeup. Those within the transgender community and those so-called allies of the transgender community who want to cite things like Klinefelter syndrome and other rare chromosomal abnormalities do so with the full knowledge that those chromosomal abnormalities, which affect chromosomal makeup and therefore sometimes affect whether or not a person has genitalia that is incorrect for their biological sex, or that they have a confused sexual makeup, they do so with the full knowledge that that affects less than 1% of the population. Okay, that's the reality. And so they extrapolate that out to rationalize the rest of the population. And transgenderism over the past 20 years has become a social contagion. We're talking about gender dysphoria, which has at most affected about 700,000 people in a population of over 300 million in the United States. It is a recognized condition within the DSM. It is not anything other than a disorder. It is not anything other than a delusion that a certain number of people suffer from. It is less than 1% of the population. In fact, less than 0.5% of the population actually suffer from gender dysphoria, actually have a valid diagnosis of gender dysphoria outside of a social contagion. Those people, it's a tragic condition to suffer from. I'm not discounting that. I'm not discounting that they need qualified medical and mental health treatment. One of the questions that I have is, how many people who actually seek treatment from mental health professionals ever actually get better? That's the problem I have with the mental health profession at this juncture. is someone who has family members who have suffered greatly from mental health challenges and whatnot. How many people who actually go to seek treatment from a qualified therapist, a licensed clinical social worker, a mental health counselor of any kind, how many actually get better? How many actually recover and become functional again? And I submit to you, based on my observation, the number is very small. It's extremely rare that a therapist or a mental health counselor of any sort has a plan to get people out of therapy and back to functioning adulthood, back to a functional life. That's just the reality of it. And so a lot of counselors who treat the LGBTQIA plus community, as it were, have given up on trying to cure them, trying to get them back to a normalized sexual or gender expression that corresponds to their biological sex or corresponds to the normative standards of humanity, the biological normative standards of humanity, because let's face it, gender and sex are both binary. If you divorce gender as a social construct from biological sex, you basically render it meaningless, and you arrive at the juncture that we're at, or at the destination that we're at, where there are 80 plus genders, depending on which ideological extremist you talk to. And Russell M. Nelson's fine with that. Like, he did not condemn that. In the wards and stakes that he presided over as the prophet, seer, and revelator of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, what was increasingly apparent was that the church is moving towards the accommodation, if not outright endorsement, of the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, intersex, and asexual plus lifestyles. Like, we have transgender members. First off, that's an oxymoron. You cannot be a Christian and you cannot be transgender. You cannot be a Christian who is openly, actively homosexual, whose identity is anything other than Christian. You can't be that. It's an oxymoronic concept, like Central Intelligence Agency or virtuous pedophile. I saw that a few years back. There was a man, I don't know if it was satire or not, but he was going on morning television shows and calling himself a virtuous pedophile because although he acknowledged that he was attracted to children, he said that he did not act on his attraction. At the end of the day, this is the world in which we live. It's the world in which we live since 2018. We have a prophet who didn't prophesy. That should be your first sign, if you're a Latter-day Saint, that something is very wrong in Zion, that your prophet doesn't prophesy, that he receives no revelation whatsoever from God, and that his actions while he is the prophet, seer, and revelator betray the fact that he has no connection to God whatsoever. And if you look at the way the church has proceeded with openly gay married men such as Charlie Bird and his husband, holding church callings and doing so without any consequence whatsoever, there's your sign. The Bible is very clear about sexual immorality. And I don't mean to just say that's the case with homosexuals in the church, or lesbians. I don't mean to say that, I don't mean to single them out, because I am aware of heterosexual men who are habitual adulterers, who have been disfellowshipped, excommunicated, in some cases multiple times they've been excommunicated, and they've always been rebaptized into the church. In fact, over the past week, I had someone reach out to me with concerns about the fact that a man who had been married 4 times, cheated on all of his wives, had been abusive to all of his children, had been welcomed back into the church by a high council, had his priesthood privileges restored, even though he had not been in attendance, even though he admitted to being an adulterer, even though he admitted to abusing his children, who are all now adults. And so he was told he had to make amends with them. But like many men in his position, he had to make amends on his terms, and when they confronted him with what he had done, as opposed to just accepting his half-hearted apology, and they made him listen to their take on it, and they expressed their disagreement with how he had behaved himself as a father and as a husband, he blew up at them. Because here's the thing in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints that many of these apostates feel is that they're entitled to forgiveness. Even forgiveness that they've never really asked for, even when they've never made sincere amends or expressed any kind of contrition whatsoever. They haven't tried to restore their victims or compensate them in any way for the damage that they've inflicted on them. And it's not just homosexuals. It's not just lesbians. It's just not so-called queer people. It's not transgenders. It is men who are ostensibly heterosexual, who have used their priesthood position in their homes and in their churches to abuse their wives, abuse their children, abuse others outside of their family, sexually, emotionally, physically, and otherwise. And they felt immune from the consequences because they held the priesthood. And what are you going to do? You going to go to another priesthood holder? Are you going to tell on me? I might get disfellowshipped. I might get excommunicated. But at the end of the day, we all know I'm going to get rebaptized after a time, and I'll be right back at it. That has happened time and time again that I'm aware of. And it happened under the tenure of Russell M. Nelson. It happened under his predecessors as well. But we're talking about Russell M. Nelson because he is the recently deceased prophet, seer, and revelator of the church who did not prophesy over the tenure, who sat in authority over developments in the church that were clearly in conflict with the doctrine of the church. And of course, we have multiple Quorum of the 12 members who have LGBTQIA children and siblings. And what we don't look at is the family that produced this kind of behavior. We don't look at that at all. Like, that's the reality of it. We do not look at it as though there's something afoot with the upbringing that would lead to this kind of behavior, would lead to this kind of identity. We don't look at it from that perspective at all. There was a series I did on investigations in ritual abuse over the role of bisexuality in ritual abuse groups in the LDS Church of Satan, in which I cited academic studies that said well over 70+% of those who identify as LGBTQIA openly said in those studies that they had been the victims in their childhood. They had been the victims of childhood sexual abuse, that they had been the victims of childhood physical abuse at an even higher rate. And so what we know, based on the emerging academic literature and the studies that have been done, is that many people who grow up to identify as LGBTQIA were exposed to absolutely horrendous abuse as children. And that abuse affected and normalized behavior that would have been considered deviant in any other context. A lot of women that I know who are lesbians suffer tremendous abuse at the hands of male figures in their lives. And so consequently, the idea of having a sexual relationship with a man is kind of a no-fly zone for them. You know, they were horrifically abused by a father figure a male sibling or a male cousin or even a male romantic partner. And consequently, it has affected their ability to enter into relationships with someone of the opposite sex, and they identify as lesbians as a result. And I've had very frank discussions with many of those women um, who identify as lesbians. And it's not that I'm homophobic. I'm not afraid of anybody who's gay. I've sat down and had conversations with many of my gay friends. And all of them disclose absolutely horrific sexual abuse or sexually inappropriate conduct directed at them over the course of their childhood and their developmental years, well into adolescence. And it certainly, I don't think that you can discount the role that that plays in them growing up to be adults who identify as LGBTQIA. And so when we see an adult who grew up in a Latter-day Saint home, where the law of chastity, the word of wisdom, church doctrines were presumably emphasized and modeled for them as children by the adults in their lives, and they grow up to say, I'm gay, or I'm a lesbian, or I'm bisexual, or I'm transgender, we need to be looking at the parents. We need to be looking at the grandparents. We need to be looking at the adults who are in their lives a lot more closely. And so when you see an apostle like Garrett Walter Gong, whose son is openly gay, openly identifies as queer all over social media, you need to be taking a hard look at Garrett Walter Gong, especially given his familial connection to the Hamlin case, to the fact that his mother, Jean Fung Char, who was identified in the obituaries of all three DeYoung sisters as being a sister by affection. And of course, I'm talking about Karma DeYoung, Karma Anderson, who was married to Richard Lloyd Anderson. I'm talking about Nola Eloise DeYoung, Nola Sullivan, and I'm talking about Belle Felice DeYoung, Belle Van Wagenen, all the daughters of Garrett DeYoung Jr., the first dean of the Fine Arts Department at BYU. She lived with Karma and Garrett when she was attending BYU. Jean Fung Char did. She likely met Nola and Clyde Sullivan during Clyde's graduate work at the University of California, Berkeley, because the Latter-day Saints in the Bay Area met at a ward at a Scottish Rite temple in Burlingame. And the timelines dovetail between Clyde Sullivan's graduate work in that area and Jean Fung Char's time on the West Coast. And according to Jean Fung Char, or Jean Gong, as she would later be known, when she arrived at BYU, someone had endowed a scholarship in her name. She had just arrived to register. She lived with Garrett DeYoung Jr., and his youngest daughter, Karma, who was at that time about 15 or 16 years of age. She lived with him. She traveled with him. She had a familial connection with him. And according to the Hamlin victim statements, Garrett and Karma were both members of the quote-unquote the group or the LDS Church of Satan. And that's according to Karma's granddaughters, Rachel, Eliza, and Catherine Hamlin. So when we're seeing Garrett Walter Gong and his son is identifying as queer, he's a member of the Quorum of the 12, we need to take a closer look at Garrett Walter Gong. We need to take a closer look at the other adults that were part of, I believe, Matthew Gong's upbringing. We also need to look at the fact that Garrett Walter Gong frequently socializes with an excommunicated Latter-day Saint named Gordon Stewart Bowen, an advertising executive at Dentsu McGarry Bowen, or at least he was. He is no longer listed in the court filings of Dempsey McGarry Bowen are on their website. He frequently, and I know this from multiple sources, plays pickleball with Gordon Bowen at Bowen's home in Holiday, Utah. He frequently visits and socializes, along with other Quorum of the 12 members, at Bowen's home. And Gordon Bowen was excommunicated back in 2003. And so when we consider the fact that a Quorum of the 12 member is comfortable socializing even now, 22 years after excommunication, with a man who was excommunicated in part due to his proclivities for accessing homosexual pornography and for calling gay male escort services to the tune of thousands of times over a 6-month period. These things should raise eyebrows. These things should lead to hard questions, not just for Garrett Walter Gong, but for other members of the Quorum of the 12 that I am aware of who socialize and consult with Gordon Bowen on church matters, all of which occurred under the leadership of Russell M. Nelson. All of that occurred under his leadership. He was the president of the Corporation of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. He is the so-called prophet, seer, and revelator. Again, never prophesied once. Not a single prophecy of his has ever been canonized. So you won't find it in the Doctrine and Covenants. Because he's a prophet, he didn't prophesy. And as I said before, there's your sign. The fact that leaders of the church under his leadership socialized with excommunicated Latter-day Saints such as Gordon Stewart Bowen, who was accused of multiple instances of child sexual abuse during and after his divorce, and before by the Hamlin sisters, who named him as the punisher for the High Council of the LDS Church of Satan. The fact that this occurred under Russell M. Nelson's leadership, not a good look. Now, what I'm saying here is that we should be asking hard questions. That the church rank and file should be asking hard questions. I left the church in part due to what I found in the Hamlin case and the fact that even though it was reported up the church ladder, they showed absolutely zero interest in holding any of these people to an account. A lot of the people named in those Hamlin victim statements are still active church members with active callings. That's just inexcusable, because even short of the child sexual abuse allegations against them, the reality of it is many of them had other allegations that are incontrovertibly true. They held dual membership in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and outside organizations that were clearly mutually exclusive in doctrine and beliefs and practice to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And I'm talking about Native American churches that utilize peyote and other substances in their religious rites. This is fundamentally incompatible with church doctrine. It's fundamentally incompatible with the word of wisdom. And the things that went on at those ceremonies from multiple people that I spoke to often devolved into sexual acts. And again, these people are active members, even today. In Gordon Bowen's divorce proceedings, I've read the depositions in which he is confronted about the writing in his journal about Kevin and Khalil Kelly. Lincoln Kevin Kelly was his co-worker at Ogilvy Mather and at Bonneville. And he talked about, or he wrote about, Gordon Stewart Bowen did, he wrote about the H issue, or the homosexual issue, raging in them both. And he said that that was the basis of his association with him, because he himself also had that issue. He was calling gay escort services. He was using work computers to peruse gay pornography he was allegedly importing boys from Utah to New York, and promising them that if they stayed with him at his home, he would pay money to fix their teeth, among other things. He allegedly missed a work meeting with a major account holder at his advertising agency, and he was later found tied up and smeared with feces. This is in his divorce record. And what's in his divorce record is consistent with what the Hamlin sisters contend he did. Because the Hamlin sisters go into graphic detail about how Gordon Stewart Bowen tied them up in his workshop, urinated on them, ejaculated on them, tortured them sexually for hours, with the full consent of their mother, Roselle Stevenson, who was just outside in Bowen's residence at that time on Yale Avenue. This is who the church, under Russell M. Nelson, consults on marketing and advertising strategies. This is the man that church authorities, quorum of the 12 and up, visit and socialize with. I have had multiple sources tell me that Dieter Uchtdorf had his birthday party at Gordon Bowen's home in Holiday. That's the reality that we're faced with. That is who these people are associating with. And these are the prophets. These are the apostles. These are members of the First Presidency and the Quorum of the 12, and people who are general authorities, even though Gordon Bowen has been excommunicated for over 22 years. And to be quite frank with you, in the coming weeks, there are things that are going to come out. Allegations that I have been aware of for 2-3 years, but my standard for this is I have to have pretty incontrovertible evidence before I will come out and say that somebody did what they were accused of in sexual abuse. Now, to be quite fair, my focus was on the Hamlin case, and I had 140 names to work with there. But I am aware of allegations against everyone from the First Presidency to the Quorum of the 12. And when I say I am aware of allegations, I'm talking 30-plus allegations apiece. I'm saying dozens of allegations against each member of the Quorum of the 12 and the First Presidency, excepting Dieter Uchtdorf, who only had one allegation against him that I was aware of. And I didn't personally believe that allegation. And Patrick Kieran, who is new to the Quorum of the 12 because he was he was called as M. Russell Ballard's replacement. And so when I say this not just as an ex-Mormon, and I don't say this to demolish anybody's faith. Your faith should be in Jesus Christ, not in the institution or in these men. And that's kind of my point here, is we have idolized these men to a point where we truly believe, even though they don't fulfill the requirements of an apostle in terms of their associations, in terms of how their children and siblings behave. I'm sorry if you have a gay son or you have a gay sibling. We need to take a closer look at your family, especially given that you raised that child. And a lot of people who might recoil at that. But given the link between sexual degeneracy or deviancy and childhood sexual abuse, there is probably something there. And given the fact that you were hanging out with an open, notorious, unrepentant homosexual and sexual sadist like Gordon Bowen, allegedly. You're socializing with him, you're directing church business to him, You directed church business to him to the tune of millions of dollars to produce a film about the life of Christ that was never released because after a viewing by general authorities and quorum of the 12 members and first presidency members at Bowen's home, it was deemed unsalvageable. And I've talked with people on church committees who were tasked with trying to do something with the footage from that film. And the church basically just lost its money. And what's extraordinary about it is the church directed that money and that funding and gave Gordon Bowen that responsibility after Bowen had been excommunicated from the church. And they knew what he was. They knew why he was excommunicated, and they still did business with him, and they still used tithing money to fund projects that he oversaw. And all of these elements together, all of these elements taken together, the sexual abuse allegations that I'm aware of against the top leaders of the church, including Russell M. Nelson, not just the cover-up that was recently covered on We Are the People, Utah, with Justin Riggs, which if you have not seen, you need to go see that. I was truly impressed with the job that Justin Riggs did covering the bountiful sex scandal and Russell M. Nelson's role in covering it up. He did not find the smoking gun document that I hoped he would find, but he did find it enough to make a compelling case against Russell M. Nelson. And We Are the People, Utah, is going to be dropping some other shows featuring Justin, who does excellent work. So if you don't have a chance, if you have a chance, if you have the time, I would highly encourage you to go look at that episode, go watch that episode on We Are the People, Utah, covering Russell M. Nelson's role in the bountiful sex scandal and Bill Karstensen. And the details and the facts around that are just astonishing. Now we get to the other part of my objection to Russell M. Nelson, which is not just that he covered up sexual abuse, not just that under his leadership, open, unrepentant apostasy was present within the church and the church's leadership as it pertained to the LGBTQIA issue. It's COVID. It's what the church did in COVID, which betrayed a complete lack of spiritual discernment. And quite frankly, a lot of what the church did during COVID, what the church leadership did during COVID, dovetailed with its desire to be accepted by the world, which is the worst thing you can do as a Christian. It's the worst thing you can do as a Latter-day Saint. I mean, to declare your allegiance to Christ and your loyalty to Christ is to declare your enmity with the world and with the norms of the world. You're saying you're going to be sexually pure. You're saying that your focus is going to be on pleasing God rather than men. And the church went in the complete opposite direction. And they encouraged their members to be subjected to or injected with an emergency use authorization medication that had not been fully tested, that was not scientifically validated. In every prior trial, every prior animal trial of mRNA therapies resulted in the same outcomes that we're seeing today. It resulted in infertility. It resulted in turbocancers. It resulted in like heart inflammation, myocarditis. All of these ailments that we're seeing, all of this excess mortality that we're seeing, we knew about it years ago, years before the COVID vaccines or the COVID jabs were a thing. It was entirely foreseeable. And Russell M. Nelson, being a physician, should have known this, probably did know it. But he proceeded to use his position, and so did other church leaders, to encourage Latter-day Saints to take those therapies, those mRNA therapies. And like sexual abuse, you can throw a stone in any direction, and you can hit somebody who is either sexually abused or somebody who has had health issues as a result of the fact that they got those jabs, the fact that they received those mRNA therapies. They've had myocarditis. They've experienced rare cancers. They buried family members as a result of illnesses that are arguably connected to those COVID jabs. And the church encouraged members to be all in on this. And the church under Russell M. Nelson encouraged members to be all in on this. And being a priesthood holder is something you shouldn't take lightly, because people rely on you. They think that you have spiritual discernment that extends to these types of matters. They trust you. And in the aftermath of COVID, what we all saw was that Russell M. Nelson was a false prophet. He didn't have any spiritual discernment. He didn't have any scientific discernment. Because if he did, he would have reviewed the medical literature that existed before those mRNA therapies were rolled out under Operation Warp Speed. And he would have said no in every prior trial and every prior study that's ever been done on this technology, these types of therapies. The results have been nothing short of disastrous. The results have been lethal. And therefore, no Latter-day Saint should get it. And by the way, the church will be opening its doors regardless of shutdown orders, because, as it says in Acts, we should obey God, not the government. And when you're saying, on the one hand, as civil authorities, that liquor stores and strip clubs are essential businesses and they don't have to close their doors, but churches have to close their doors because it's a public health threat, you're full of shit. Like, at the end of the day, Russell M. Nelson and the other leaders of the church did not stand against this. They stood united in compliance with it, which says everything about where they are doctrinally and spiritually. And I'm afraid that what you're going to see in the coming weeks is more of the same, because this is infested the church at all levels. And that brings us to the events of the past couple of days, or today, in Grand Blanc, Michigan, where a lunatic ran his truck through the front doors of the meeting house. And when people started to exit, because they were told to exit, he opened fire on them. Death toll is at least 4 at this time. There were reported 20-plus people who were unaccounted for. And after he shot multiple people, killed at least 4, he then set fire to the meeting house, burned it, razed it. Now, he was allegedly shot by a second counselor during his rampage and neutralized as a result of that. That the early reports were that was what happened. But here's the thing. The church recently issued policy saying that members could not carry in meeting houses and stake centers, that basically signaled to people like this lunatic in Grand Blanc that Latter-day Saints are sitting ducks if they comply with their church's policy. Now, we have all of these trans people and all of these homosexuals and lesbians and bisexuals who are not complying with church doctrine or policy. They're being given free rein. They can be open and unrepentant in their apostasy and their sin, and they can hold church callings like Charlie Kirk and his husband do in their ward in their stake, and they can do it with impunity. But God forbid you exercise an explicitly guaranteed constitutional right and carry inside of a ward meeting house or a stake center or on the property of the church at all. Because if you do that, well, that's just wrong. And what it signified, or what the message that it sent to people like the man who drove through the front doors of that building, it killed those people, is that if they're obedient to their church leadership, if they're deferential to the priesthood authority of these high-ranking men who issue the church's policies, guess what? They're sitting ducks for martyrdom. So what I would say to Latter-day Saints is, you know what the church is. You know what the church has become, and the church is in apostasy. Gadiant and robbers are real. This is a church that secretly accrued some $300 billion in investment assets. They used your tithe dollars to do it. They concealed it from you. They got in trouble with the government because they were trying to conceal what they were doing from the government. And this is no longer a church. It's a hedge fund masquerading as a church. It's a hedge fund that allows transgender members to walk the hallways with impunity and to use the bathroom that corresponds to their so-called correct gender with impunity, and biological women, biological females who are Latter-day Saints have to wait outside while a biological male in a dress relieves himself in the women's restroom and in the meeting houses and the stake centers. That's the level of accommodation that they're giving to someone who is mentally ill. And they're doing it at the expense of women's spaces. They're doing it at the expense of obedient, compliant, doctrinally and scientifically correct biological female Latter-day Saints who have done nothing to deserve this. And if we really want to get down to brass tacks, the entire transgender movement appears to be a group of men who get off sexually on invading women's spaces. That's what it is. And the fact that the church and its priesthood holders at the highest levels are tolerating this in the name of compassion is just absolutely absurd. It's unbiblical. It's satanic. And I can't sit here and mince words about it. Everything that you're seeing play out in the church right now, in the aftermath of the death of Russell M. Nelson, and even before the death of Russell M. Nelson, is evidence that Russell M. Nelson was not actually a prophet. Any one of you watching this, I'm perfectly okay with you messaging me, like, what prophecy did Russell M. Nelson make that is actually canon? Well, what? He's a prophet who didn't prophesy. From 2018 to 2025, when he died at 101 years of age, there weren't any prophecies that emanated from Russell M. Nelson. And there won't be any prophecies from his successors. Not any valid prophecies that conform to prior revelation. And I've said it before on an earlier weekend review, the church is moving towards the embrace of open apostasy and open sexual degeneracy. That is, you are going to see same-sex sealings in temples in the next 5 to 10 years. You're going to see that. And then you're going to have to make up your mind as to whether or not you believe that this is the Church of Jesus Christ, or whether you believe that it is the Church of Baal and Asherah. Because as I've written about on investigations and ritual abuse, there are actual BYU professors who analogize Heavenly Mother to Asherah, Baal's consort, in the Canaanite and Ugarit pantheon of gods. And that is the religion within the religion at the highest levels of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. It is Baal worship. It is a sex cult operating within the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And sometimes it manifests in the form of these satanic ritual abuse groups, and sometimes it's more explicit than that. But that's what the church is tiptoeing towards. That's what it's been tiptoeing towards for decades now. And when you're talking about 14 of the top 15 officers of the church having sexual abuse allegations against them, that speaks volumes. And in the coming weeks, you're going to see a lot of that emerging. You're going to see it on shows like We Are the People Utah. You're going to see it on other platforms as well. Because more and more victims are going to come out in the aftermath of Russell M. Nelson's death, and my hat's off to him. It takes a lot of courage and a lot of balls to come out and say what this man did. And the victims I spoke to about Russell M. Nelson's alleged sexual misconduct and his sexual abuse of children universally told the same story, and that is that he was incredibly sadistic because he suffered from erectile dysfunction during sexual abuse, and he would get angry about it. And we're talking about instances of abuse from like the late 80s, early 90s on. And he was already in his late 50s, early 60s. And like a lot of men of that age, he suffered from erectile dysfunction. And his victims would suffer even more when he would get angry about his inability to get an erection during a sexual abuse episode. That's the level of what we're dealing with here. That's the legacy of this man. He didn't just cover up the abuse allegations against his son-in-law and his daughter. He allegedly, according to dozens of people that I've spoken to and dozens of accounts that I've read, sexually abused children. And he did it over the course of at least 45 years. That's the legacy of Russell M. Nelson. That and the apostasy that has infected the church at all levels, the association, the open association with ex-Latter-day Saints who, quite frankly, should not be privy to anything the church does, and certainly should not be the social acquaintances of apostles and members of the First Presidency. This has been Investigations in Ritual Abuse and AntiTribe's Week in Review. And this has been the developments in Mormondom. And all of it traces back from COVID to what happened in Grand Blanc, Michigan today, to the continuing epidemic of sexual abuse at all levels of the church, to open, unscriptural conduct being normalized and tolerated within wards and stakes. All of it traces back to the leadership of this man, Russell M. Nelson. And this may seem a little harsh to some of you watching, but I believe Russell M. Nelson was quite surprised when he came to on the other side at where he wound up, because he's not a god in the highest degree of celestial glory. When we violate God's laws, when we try to use our position and our influence to construct and normalize behaviors that fly in the face of what the Scripture says, Scriptures that we're bound by, no matter how high a rank we hold within an institution that professes the name of Christ. We are going to answer for that before God. And based on everything that I know about Russell M. Nelson, he's answering to God right now, and he has a lot of explaining to do. We all have a lot of explaining to do, but especially those of us who are open and unrepentant and arrogant enough to openly try to normalize and tolerate behavior that God has classified as sin. There's not a single verse in the Bible that condones LGBTQIA behavior. There's not a single verse in the Bible that condones the tolerance of child sexual abuse or the forgiveness of perpetrators of that abuse. It doesn't exist, especially when those perpetrators have been exposed to the truth of the gospel and still persisted in that type of conduct. This is IRA and AntiTribe Weekend Review number 3, Developments in Mormondom. I'll see you next week.